Gothic. What does the word make you think of? Most likely, it conjures up imagery of alternative kids with jet black hair and a plethora of black clothing. Then again, it may make you think of grand medieval architecture and vast cathedrals with elaborate decoration rendered in stone and glass. Perhaps the last thing that Gothic would make you think of would be the late antique Germanic people, known for their infamous sack of Rome in 410 AD, the Goths. And yet, it was the Goths who lent their name to the Gothic subculture and the Gothic artistic and architectural movements. Drawing on the violent history of the Goths, for it was these Germanic people who sacked Rome in 410 AD, the name Gothic, never used by medieval artists and architects, was brought back into usage during the Renaissance as a pejorative. Giorgio Vasari, Italian architect and historian, used it in the 540s in an attempt to denigrate the styles of the medieval period, which he considered to be barbaric. By the 18th and 19th centuries, renewed interest in medievalism led to a revival of Gothic architecture and a new Gothic movement in literature, with authors taking a notable interest in the macabre, such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. By the mid to late 20th century, Gothic had begun to influence music too, arguably giving rise to the Gothic subculture that we see today. Throughout all these incarnations, the original meaning of the word Goth has become obscured. This Germanic people are little known beyond their name, but they had an enormous impact on the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, and a major part to play in the post-Roman history of Western Europe. It is true that they sacked Rome, and never truly lived it down. However, there is much more to these Goths than that. They were craftsmen and artists, producing some incredibly fine golden artefacts. They farmed and traded, often enjoying cordial relations with their neighbours. Their fierce warriors fought both against and alongside the armies of the Romans. Note that I will briefly discuss the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, but these two peoples are certainly worthy of their own in-depth videos. Today we will attempt to better understand this people and answer the question: who were the Goths? The earliest origins of the Goths, as with many peoples in ancient Europe, beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, are shrouded in mystery and semi-legend. The earliest written sources we have which appear to discuss the Goths are Roman, and date from the 1st century AD. However, these are somewhat unclear in their placement of the Goths, probably owing in large part to the fact that these regions these Roman authors were discussing lay far beyond the boundaries of the empire. For the earliest origins of the Goths, we must turn to a later text penned in the mid-6th century by none other than a Goth, a bureaucrat working in Constantinople, by the name of Jordanes. In his stunning work, known as Getica, Jordanes offers a glimpse into the earliest history of the Goths. Although his account was no doubt influenced by later texts and histories which discussed this Germanic people, Jordanes must have been in close touch with his Gothic culture, and perhaps made use of oral traditions that were no doubt passed down through it. On the homeland of the Goths, Jordanes has this to say: "The mighty sea, which has in its Arctic region, that is in the north, a great island named Scanza, from which my tale, by God's grace, shall take its beginning. For the race whose origin you ask to know, burst forth like a swarm of bees from the midst of this island, and came into the land of Europe." Located across the Baltic Sea, northwards of the mouth of the Vistula, Jordanes' Scanza can be none other than Scandinavia. It is from here, the Gothic author reports, that his people issued forth, migrating southwards into the European mainland under their king Berig, settling in the region he names as Gothiscanza. It is natural to be critical of such a claim, given that Jordanes was writing centuries after the events that he describes. Although subject to some debate, it is generally agreed that what scant sources we do have concerning the origins of the Goths do point to a Scandinavian origin. While Jordanes' claims of a wholesale migration of the entire Gothic people is possible, it seems more likely that such a migration would have been a slower process, taking place over the course of many decades. Furthermore, it is thought that the Gothic settlement in Gothiscanza, described by Jordanes, may well relate to the Weilbach culture, a material culture which flourished around the Lower Vistula in the 1st century AD. The Weilbach culture, closely associated with Germanic peoples, in particular the Goths, replaced the previously resident Oskiwi culture and is marked by the use of stone circles, inhumation, and the lack of weapons in warrior graves. There are literary attestations concerning the Goths' time on the shores of the Baltic too. Writing in the late 1st century AD, Pliny the Elder described a group called the Gutones as belonging to the Vandalic peoples, whereas Tacitus, writing in around 98 AD, explained that a group of Germani known as Gothones dwelt beyond the Vandals near the ocean. The location of the Szeworsk culture, associated with the Vandals, to the south of the Weilbach culture, certainly appears to support this assertion. Intriguingly, Tacitus also details in his Annals how the Gothones assisted a certain noble named Catualda in overthrowing the hegemony of the Marcomanni. The 2nd century brought with it enormous upheaval for the Goths, as the Weilbach culture appears to have begun a wholesale geographical shift southeastward, towards the shores of the Black Sea. This migration did not happen in isolation either, but was rather a part of the wider southern movement of Germanic tribes in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. The reasons for these migrations are heavily debated and include the desire for more fertile lands, massive population growth, and military and social pressure from other migrating tribes, which caused a domino effect. It was likely the migrations of groups such as the Vandals and the Goths which precipitated the beginning of the Marcomannic Wars. Lasting from 166 to 180 AD, these conflicts saw Germanic Cadi and Marcomanni tribes crossing the Danube frontier into the Roman Empire in search of new lands in which to settle, themselves having been ejected from their homelands by the Vandals and Goths. According to Jordanes, the Goths, led by a king named Philomer, eventually reached the land north of the Black Sea, named in antiquity as Scythia. This part of the Goths, which is said to have crossed the river and entered with Philomer into the country of Oium, came into possession of the desired land, and there they soon came upon the race of the Sparli, joined battle with them, and won the victory. Hence the victors hastened to the farthest part of Scythia, which is near the Sea of Pontus, for so the story is generally told in their early songs, in almost historic fashion. Defeating the resident Sparli, who were perhaps Sarmatians, the Goths settled in the fertile regions north of the Black Sea, largely within the modern borders of Ukraine. Although the history of Philomer is debated, Jordanes' account appears to be largely borne out by the archaeological record, for by the mid-3rd century AD, the southern movement of the Weilbach culture seems to have led to the formation of the Cherniakov culture. And although not exclusively comprised of Goths, the Cherniakov culture, attested from evidence discovered at some 3,000 sites, is certainly believed to have been dominated by them. So began a period of sedentary settlement by the Goths, during which their society developed an agricultural focus. So too began the Goths' relationship with the Roman Empire, a sometimes collaborative, often antagonistic relationship, which saw regular Gothic raids into Roman territory. This is also the period in which Roman sources began to write in earnest on the subject of the Goths. Beginning with the sack of Histria on the mouth of the Danube in 238 AD, the Goths embarked upon decades of raiding into Roman lands, even defeating and killing the Emperor Decius at the Battle of Abritus in 251 AD, led by a chieftain named Gniva. These Germanic incursions were not limited to land either. Gothic ships ravaged the Roman coastal settlements along the shores of the Black Sea, referred to by the Romans as the Sea of Pontus. It is likely in such a raid that the progenitors of Ulfilas, the Gothic Christian responsible for proselytizing his people, were carried off from Anatolia, taken as slaves to live in Gothic lands. Gothic raids became such an issue that successive emperors conducted campaigns in order to secure the Danube frontier. Gallienus, Claudius II, and Aurelian all fought extensively in the northern Balkans, and largely succeeded in checking Gothic movements in the region by the close of the 3rd century. The frontier thus secure, the Goths and Romans enjoyed largely peaceful relations for some decades, interspersed with the odd outbreak of warfare. Now well within the Roman sphere of political influence, the Goths found themselves involved in internal imperial politics at times. The outbreak of civil war at the beginning of the reign of Constantine the Great saw the Goths side with the losing Licinius, and suffer defeat at the hands of the victorious Constantine as a result. And in the 360s, the Goths once again intervened in Roman civil conflict, continuing their track record of backing losers when they fought on the side of the usurper Procopius against the rule of Eastern Emperor Valens. Valens' subsequent campaigns against the Goths concluded with a peace treaty in 369 between the Roman Emperor and the Gothic chief Athanaric, known to have been from the Tervingi tribe. This treaty certainly appears to have only deepened Roman-Gothic links, as a great deal of Roman goods and coinage have been found in Gothic lands beyond the Danube. It would appear that by the late 4th century AD, the Goths and Romans lived in relative peace. Trading benefited both peoples. Gothic troops regularly served under Roman banners, and Gothic chieftains enjoyed ever closer political relations with Roman imperial power. The westward movement of the Huns, whose progress across the Eurasian steppe brought with it enormous upheaval, had a dire impact upon the Goths. The nomadic Huns were fiercely warlike, fighting on horseback and armed with highly effective composite bows. Although they had encountered steppe peoples before, Roman authors recognized the Huns as a uniquely dangerous threat. Roman attitudes towards them are nicely reflected in a passage from the Res Gestae of the 4th century Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus. He described the Huns as having squat bodies, strong limbs, and thick necks, and are so prodigiously ugly and bent that they might be two-legged animals, or figures crudely carved from stumps which are seen on the parapets of bridges. The arrival of the Huns was an unmitigated disaster for the Goths. Hunnic attacks on the Alans put them to flight, and a combination of Hun and Alan pressure easternmost Goths, known as the Greuthungi, to abandon their lands north of the Black Sea following a period of resistance, joining the Tervingi Goths further west, who at this time were still led by the chieftain Athanaric. Despite Athanaric's desire to resist the Huns, near-constant attacks proved to be overwhelming, and the Goths were sent into a headlong westward flight. Petitioning the Emperor Valens, the Goths requested permission to settle in the Roman-controlled Balkans. The Eastern Roman Emperor, realizing the threat that such large numbers of Goths could pose, attempted to divide them, granting only the Tervingi the right to cross the frontier in 376 AD. However, this policy was to prove disastrous when the Tervingi, apparently agitated by a lack of food supplies and perhaps also by corrupt Roman officials attempting to exploit their weakness, rose in open revolt against imperial authorities in early 377 AD. The Greuthungi took their chance and crossed the frontier, joining their compatriots in the Balkans. For over a year, the region remained in a state of ferment, until in the summer of 378, the Eastern Emperor Valens, finally able to marshal his forces, marched upon the Goths, with his nephew, the Western Roman Emperor Gratian, approaching from the west. On the 9th of August, 378 AD, the Emperor Valens, eager to secure the victory, and therefore the plaudits, engaged the Gothic forces at Adrianople in the Balkans. Possibly acting on false intelligence that the Goths only numbered some 10,000 men, the battle was an utter defeat for the Romans, perhaps on par with the massacre at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Led by a Tervingi king Fritigern, the Goths completely routed an impetuous and unprepared imperial field army, largely aided by their heavy cavalrymen. Roman casualties are estimated to have been as high as 10 to 15,000 men. Perhaps even more embarrassing was the death of Valens himself on the battlefield. It is unknown exactly how the emperor perished, but it seems likely that he would have been separated from his bodyguard and slain in the rout. Adrianople was a turning point, not just for the Goths, but for the entire Roman Empire. Arguably, it was this defeat which set in motion a chain of events which eventually led to the downfall of the Roman Empire in the west. Following the battle, the Goths found themselves as masters of the Balkans. In 382 AD, the new Eastern Emperor Theodosius I, realizing that defeating the Goths by military means would be incredibly difficult, made peace. The treaty allowed the Goths to freely settle in the Balkans, under their own leaders, in return for pledges of military support to the Eastern Emperor. The peace brought with it some semblance of the stability that the Goths had been seeking for decades. Ensconced in their new lands, these Germanic people were once again able to resume their agricultural society. It was in this violent aftermath of the Hunnic invasions that a split emerged in the Goths. The majority of those who had crossed the frontier into the empire came to be known as Visigoths, literally Western Goths, whilst the bulk of those that remained subject to the Huns were known as Ostrogoths or Eastern Goths. This uneasy peace was not to last, however. The actions of two Gothic chieftains, by the names of Radagaisus and Alaric, once again threw the Roman Empire into chaos, and culminated in an event which gave the Goths their reputation as despoilers, the 410 AD sack of Rome. We shall return to the historical narrative later. For now, we shall take a look at the society and culture of the Goths. Gothic society, like the vast majority of contemporary societies, was highly stratified, and appears by the 3rd and 4th centuries AD to have been divided into clans or kindreds, usually based around the rule of associated great families, who inhabited roughly delineated geographical areas, forming single economic, social, and political units. Generally, each village was dominated by one such great family. Wealthy Gothic villages often owned considerable portions of land, whilst the majority of the population were common peasants, surviving through subsistence farming. Slaves of various kinds, either indentured servants or prisoners of war, performed many of society's menial tasks. Councils did exist, often led by elders, and would convene in villages under special circumstances. True political power appears to have been primarily concentrated in the hands of warlords, known as Reichs, who were often the heads of clans or great families. The kings, or Reichs, drew their power from the great landowning families, and ruled in a somewhat centralized fashion. Certainly, there seem to have been disagreements between Reichs and local clan nobles, which betray this. Excavations of Gothic sites on the Pontic steppe appear to show small settlements, in which the vast majority of the population lived in houses or huts constructed of wood and earth, with the ground floor partially sunken into the ground to aid in protection against the elements. Many Gothic sites appear to have been located in close proximity to rivers and Roman trading outposts. The significance of animal raising is clear to see in the fact that houses often contained spaces for both humans and animals, so-called byre houses, which allowed Gothic farmers to shelter both themselves and their livestock from the harsh winters of the Black Sea steppe. I will not venture into too much detail on the society of Ostrogothic Italy or Visigothic Spain, but it is important to note that the Gothic inhabitants of these realms became increasingly Romanized as the decades and centuries wore on. The divide between the Gothic ruling class and Roman subject peoples became increasingly faint as the Germanic invaders adopted localized customs. These are perhaps most visible in the art and architecture of these kingdoms. Many elements of Gothic society were changed a great deal through increasing contact with the Roman Empire. Gothic warfare was no exception. Armies comprised mostly of heavily armed infantry soldiers were the order of the day amongst the Goths. Warriors were customarily equipped with a wooden shield and a straight longsword, or a scramasax, a kind of small sword or fighting knife often used by Germanic warriors. Throwing weapons such as axes and polearms such as spears were often used. The Goths did not have standing armies in the Roman style. Instead, the vast majority of Gothic warriors would have been farmers, raised as levies on a short-term basis, and sent home to their farms upon the conclusion of a campaign. This system was relatively cheap and easy to operate, but did mean that Gothic armies could usually not rove abroad for long periods of time, at least not during the periods in which the Goths were a sedentary, agricultural people. The majority of Gothic troops would have been lightly armoured, relying primarily on their shields for defence. Richer warriors, such as noblemen, made use of metal armour, particularly as the Goths became settled in the land north of the Black Sea, and links with Romans became ever closer. Indeed, as the centuries progressed, well-armed Gothic troops became near indistinguishable from their Roman counterparts, making use of chainmail or lamella shirts, greaves, vambraces, and helmets constructed of either iron or steel, often in the Roman ridge helm style. Despite inhabiting Scythia, a land long ruled by peoples known for their horsemanship, such as the Sarmatians, Roxolani, and Alans, the Goths did not make extensive use of cavalry. This may perhaps be largely down to the expense involved in outfitting cavalry warriors for combat, compared to infantry soldiers. Gothic cavalry appear to have favoured the heavy lance, although no doubt would have been armed with swords as an additional defensive weapon. The effectiveness of Gothic horsemen was certainly a proven fact, as at the Battle of Adrianople it was the late arrival of the cavalry which helped to carry the day for the Goths. It may well be the case that Gothic horsemen were responsible for the ignominious death of Emperor Valens. It is important to note that the Goths' ever-deepening relationship with the Romans during the 3rd and 4th centuries saw large numbers of Gothic troops serving in Roman armies. These postings doubtless not only increased Gothic martial prowess, but gifted the Goths with an intense familiarity with Roman weaponry and warfare techniques, a knowledge that the Goths were certainly able to make use of during their many periods of warfare with the Empire. Gothic troops served both in Roman units as individuals and in separate Gothic units, or foederati. Large numbers of Gothic troops were known to have participated in the Battle of the Frigidus, on the side of the Roman Emperor Theodosius I, as he quashed the rebellion of the usurper Eugenius. Discoveries made at the sites associated with the Cherniakov culture paints a picture of a society which primarily revolved around subsistence farming. Settlements were usually located in fertile river valleys so as to increase crop yields, and cereals such as wheat, barley, and millet were most commonly grown. As with most contemporary cultures, animal husbandry was crucial to the lives of many Goths. The discovery of large numbers of cattle bones would suggest that these animals were most often raised, but sheep, goats, and pigs were also kept, providing not only food, but hides and wool for clothing. Craft production was certainly carried out by the Goths, but likely on a very local scale. Evidently metalworking was practiced by the Goths, as implements used for agriculture have been found, including ploughshares, sickles, and scythes, as well as other items such as brooches and belt buckles. Fibulae, metal brooches for the fixing of clothing, and combs made of bone are commonly found at Gothic settlements. Pottery was also produced. Relatively simple storage jars and cooking pots, as well as wide, shallow bowls possibly used for drinking, have been found throughout Cherniakov cultural sites. Craft items appear to have been somewhat basic, and were likely not traded abroad. Trade did form a part of the Gothic economy during their period of settlement north of the Black Sea. Exports were primarily in the form of slaves, sent to the slave markets of the Roman Empire. In return, the Goths purchased a variety of Roman goods. Glassware and amphorae have been found, along with large numbers of Roman coins, which only increase in number as the 4th century progressed. Wine and oil would have been common imports. So important was trade that Ammianus Marcellinus noted how, in times of war, the interruption of trade caused severe shortages of goods amongst the Goths. The savages, since commerce was cut off, were so distressed by extreme scarcity of the necessities of life that they often sent suppliant deputations to beg for pardon and peace. The Gothic language is fascinating. It is primarily known to us from a small number of Gothic documents. The majority of these are translations of other languages, and it is therefore important to note that the Gothic in these texts is highly likely to have been influenced by these foreign languages. Most of these surviving codices are biblical texts, deriving from the translation of the Bible overseen by the Arian missionary and bishop of the Goths, Ulfilas. Many of the surviving fragments we do have are pages of parchment where the Gothic script has been erased and overwritten, but where the original lettering can still be faintly discerned. These are known as palimpsests. Part of the Indo-European language family, Gothic is an Eastern Germanic language. It has the distinguishing feature of being the oldest Germanic language with a decent number of extant texts. However, Gothic does not appear to have any modern descendants, having apparently begun to decline in usage in the mid-6th century AD through a waning of Gothic political power and the victory of Nicene Christianity over Arianism, which saw the Visigoths convert from the latter to the former. This conversion saw Gothic lose what was perhaps its only major function, as a church language. It is worth noting that a very small number of Gothic runic inscriptions do survive, which predate the Gothic alphabet. However, the identification of these is subject to some debate. It was Ulfilas, adept in Greek, Latin and Gothic, who devised the Gothic script, apparently basing it off the Greek script with Latin and runic elements thrown in. It was this new script into which Ulfilas' Bible was translated. Of the Gothic texts that do survive, the Codex Argenteus is surely the finest and best known. A 6th century illuminated manuscript containing parts of Ulfilas' 4th century translation of the Greek Bible into Gothic. It was through Ulfilas and his Bible that the Goths became the first Germanic people to develop a literate culture. That said, Gothic does not ever appear to have become much of a literary language, and beyond biblical translations was not generally used by authors. The leading writers in the Gothic kingdoms in Spain and Italy, such as Sidonius Apollinaris and Isidore of Seville, wrote in Latin. Even ethnic Goth Jordanes penned his text on the history of the Goths in Latin. We know relatively little of early Gothic artistic work. Much of what we do know concerns items found at sites associated with the Cherniakov culture. Although this archaeological culture is strongly associated with the Goths, it is also important to remind ourselves that it appears to have included a number of other groups as well, such as the Germanic Gepids and Heruli, and the Iranian nomadic peoples who previously inhabited the region, the Scythians and Sarmatians. These diverse origins do appear to be reflected in elements of Gothic art. Pottery was certainly produced, although the primary reason for the vast majority of these pieces would have been practical, such as cooking or storage. Pottery was created both by hand and by wheel, and is similar in style to equivalent Sarmatian pieces, whilst also displaying some Roman influences. Handmade pieces have a greater variety of form, and were sometimes decorated with linear designs cut into the surface of the clay. Metalworking is the artistic field in which the early Goths appear to have excelled. A variety of pieces have been found, mostly rendered in gold, including figures both of animals and of humans, and objects such as bowls, vases, and cups. The Pietra Cele treasure, a late 4th century Gothic hoard of some 22 objects, discovered in Romania in 1837, provides us with the most famous and perhaps the finest of all examples of early Gothic art. An intricate bowl depicting figures in relief displays Hellenic influences. Winding gold-wrought baskets feature designs very similar to comparable Sasanian works, and it has been suggested that the elaborate eagle brooch or fibula found in the hoard could be the result of Han Chinese artistic styles, potentially transmitted by the Huns. Eagle motifs in this period are often associated with Eastern Asia. A ring from the hoard, known as the Ring of Pietroassa, even features an example of very rare Gothic runes. Later Gothic art, such as the works created by the craft of the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, followed a similar vein. Heavily influenced by their neighbours and subject peoples, The Goths continued to produce various kinds of metalwork, including many incredible pieces inlaid with precious gems. The Germanic artistic traditions of the Visigoths and Ostrogoths appear to fade by the mid-5th century and beyond, with local Roman styles, combined with Byzantine influences, becoming the norm. Germanic motifs were replaced by plant and animal motifs originating from the Mediterranean and Near East. The crosses found at the so-called Treasure of Gurazar, the work of 7th century Visigoths, is an excellent example of this. There is evidence of Germanic metalworking here, but the ornamentation of these crosses is a total departure from early Gothic art, encrusted with sapphires, pearls, and other precious stones in a fashion very reminiscent of Byzantine style. Prior to the missions of Ulfilas in the 4th century AD, and the subsequent conversion to Arian Christianity, the Goths practiced a form of Germanic paganism. We know precious little about Gothic paganism, not least because of the short time frame between their appearance in the historical sources in the 3rd century and their abandonment of Gothic paganism in the 4th century. Pre-Christian Gothic religion, like other forms of Germanic paganism, was polytheistic, and appears to have involved the worship of not only gods, but of nature and ancestors. The Armali, a leading Gothic ruling clan or dynasty, certainly claimed descent from the divine, as mentioned by Jordanes, who explains that the Armali believed the father of the gods, Gaut or Gapt, to be their progenitor. Their genealogy I shall run through briefly, telling the lineage of each and the beginning and end of his line. And do thou, O reader, hear me without repining, for I speak truly. Now the first of these heroes, as they themselves relate in their legends, was Gapt, who begat Ulmul. It may well be that the Goths themselves considered Gaut to be their common ancestor. In any case, Gaut was a mythical ancestor deity and a creator god, and apparently father of the pantheon, drawing parallels to the later Norse god Odin. Nordgren certainly believes this to be the case, asserting that Gaut was an earlier Indo-European Odinistic god, from whom Odin may well have developed. He notes that Gaut appears to at times have had a female aspect, suggesting a pairing of male and female divinities from whom the universe issued forth, naming this female goddess as Gaudin. Aside from these scant facts, we know almost nothing of further divinities of Gothic paganism, save for the god Tiwis, associated with the Germanic god Tiwaz, and the Norse god Tyr, a war god identified as Mars by the Romans. Finally, the Gothic name Ferguneus also survives, a weather god believed by scholars to refer to an early iteration of Thor. The Romans identified Ferguneus as Jupiter. Pre-Christian Gothic religious practices are rather hard to discern too, although it seems highly likely that they would have worshipped in a similar fashion to other Germanic pagans, venerating idols, ancestors, and nature itself through the performance of ritual sacrifice. Burial practices varied, although cremation slowly gave way to inhumation. However, in one particular behaviour, Gothic paganism does differ markedly from other forms of Germanic paganism: grave weapons. Whilst grave goods are a feature of Gothic paganism, the Goths do not appear to have buried warriors with their weapons, in the fashion of almost all other Germanic pagans. However, this may have more to do with the early Christianization of the Goths. Grave weapons become most prominent in the 5th and 6th centuries AD, long after the Goths abandoned the old gods. It was Gothic raiding in the Black Sea region in the mid-3rd century AD, embarked upon with the intention of carrying off precious goods and treasures, which ultimately brought an unexpected element back to these Germanic tribesmen: Christianity. Slaves carried off northwards in such Gothic raids as these included many Christians from the coastal regions of Anatolia, such as Cappadocia and Bithynia. Once taken off to Gothic lands, many of these Christians refused to give up their faith, and were apparently permitted to continue to practice their religion amongst the pagan Goths. It was into a family of such Christian Roman prisoners that the man who was to become the apostle of the Gothic people was born: Ulfilas. Likely born in around the year 311 AD, Ulfilas was raised in a community of Cappadocian Christians, living within the realms of the Tuvingi, a Gothic people who ruled the lands north of the lower Danube, and west of the Dniester. Reaching the rank of lector within his local church, Ulfilas was chosen to accompany a diplomatic mission to Constantinople during the reign of Constantine the Great. He may have even lived in the city for a time. Exactly how Ulfilas' consecration occurred is unclear. However, what we do know is that the Gothic clergyman was anointed as Bishop of the Goths in around the year 340 AD by the Arian Archbishop of Constantinople, Eusebius of Nicomedia. Evidently the Romans saw something in the young Goth, whom they charged with returning to Gothic lands and spreading the gospel. Until 348 AD, Ulfilas dwelt in Gothic lands, preaching the Arian doctrine both to Christians and pagans. In 348 AD, his activities were arrested by persecutions, and the bishop was expelled, settling within the Roman Empire near Nicopolis, where he remained until his death in 383. During his period of exile, Ulfilas completed a monumental project, the creation of the Gothic alphabet and the translation of the Bible into Gothic. This translation was a seminal step, and one which helped to accelerate the spread of Christianity amongst the Goths. The conversion to Christianity appears to have been a relatively swift process, perhaps aided by the fact that groups of Anatolian Christians in diaspora already lived amongst the Goths. Conversion was obviously not a universal or monolithic process, however. Bouts of persecution periodically broke out, most notably in 348 AD under the Tuvingi king Eoric, and again in the mid-360s until the late 370s AD under his son Athanaric. These later persecutions included the creation of a number of Gothic martyrs. By the advent of the 5th century AD, the Goths appear to have largely converted to Christianity. However, as we have already noted, the particular form of Christianity to which the Goths subscribed was Arianism. It is important to understand the differences between Arianism and so-called Nicene Christianity. The Orthodox belief system formulated at the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. While the Orthodoxy agreed at Nicaea held that God existed in the Trinity as three persons, co-eternal and consubstantial, Arians instead believed that Jesus had been created by God. First preached by the Alexandrian priest Arius, Arianism insisted that God was eternal and uncreated, but had in fact created Christ, who in turn created the Holy Spirit. Although the First Council of Nicaea had rejected this idea in 325 AD, Arians enjoyed a certain amount of tolerance. It was not until the Second Council, held in 381 AD, that Arianism was formally declared a heresy. This official rejection of Arianism had important ramifications for the newly Christianized Goths. Despite Arianism falling from imperial favour, the Goths clung to their faith. It has been suggested that this is partly down to the Goths, and other Germanic peoples, viewing their Arian faith as being intrinsic to their identity. Arianism was not especially widespread within the Roman Empire, particularly following the declaration of the doctrine as heresy in 381 AD, so it appears to be the case that Arianism came to be closely associated with being Germanic. However, Arianism was eventually abandoned by the Visigoths of Spain during the late 6th century. Attempts to reach a doctrinal compromise between Catholics and Arians within the kingdom during the reign of King Liudvigild failed, with his successor, Recared, renouncing Arianism in favour of Chalcedonian Christianity in 587 AD. The 589 Third Council of Toledo formalised the conversion of Visigothic Spain. Persecutions of Arians ensued. The disappearance of Arianism removed a major point of contention between the increasingly Romanized Visigoths and their Hispano-Roman subjects. Following the Gothic victory at Adrianople and the settlement of large numbers of Goths within the Baltic regions of the empire, the Goths had achieved some modicum of stability, at least when compared with the chaos that they had endured due to the Hunnic invasions. The Goths, increasingly Romanized, enjoyed freer commerce with the Romans and began to utilize Roman farming techniques. However, all was not plain sailing. The traditional power structures of the Goths, upended by the flight from the Huns, left these Germanic people without strong leadership, and less able to resist the overtures of the imperial authorities, who pressed thousands of Gothic warriors into service. What is more, the Balkans were not a particularly verdant territory for an agricultural people, used to the fertile soils of the Pontic steppe. Into this power vacuum stepped a Goth named Alaric. We know little of his early life, but he does appear to have participated in the Battle of the River Frigidus, in which thousands of Gothic troops died in the service of the Emperor Theodosius. 395 was a seminal year for Alaric for two reasons. For one, the Emperor Theodosius died, the last emperor to rule over a united empire. Upon his death, the empire was split between his sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, with the Goths conspicuously in the middle. It was also in this year that the Goths rose in open revolt, with Alaric as their chief, demanding better treatment from the imperial authorities. Raiding in Greece ensued throughout the late 390s, and in late 401 or early 402, Alaric's forces invaded Italy, only turning back after fighting two inconclusive engagements with the Roman general Stilicho. By 406 AD, the pressure of the westward moving Huns had set off a chain reaction of migrating barbarian peoples, who entered the Western Roman Empire by force, seeking safety and new lands in which to settle. These migrations permanently destabilized the Western Empire, arguably directly leading to its collapse several decades later. In the spring of 406, an Ostrogothic king named Radagaisus led a confederacy of Germanic and Celtic peoples on an invasion of northern Italy, and was only defeated with great difficulty by Stilicho in the August of 406. The Roman general had to pull considerable numbers of garrison troops from the Rhine frontier in order to achieve this. In December, the great barbarian Rhine crossing saw vast numbers of Vandals, Alans and Suebi pour into the Western Empire, causing chaos across Rome and Gaul. Alaric saw his opportunity and once again marched on Italy in the spring of 408. His campaign was unexpectedly aided by imperial machinations, when, in the August of 408, the half-Vandal Roman general Stilicho was murdered on the orders of the Emperor Honorius. The death of Stilicho, perhaps the Western Empire's most capable general, was a disastrous turn of events. Stilicho's German foederati troops deserted en masse to join Alaric, along with the last remnants of Radagaisus's defeated Goths, further swelling his ranks. The Greek historian Zosimus, writing at the end of the 5th century, noted Alaric's intentions as he marched towards the vulnerable city of Rome. Alaric's demands were as follows: that each year he be paid a fixed sum of gold and be supplied a certain measure of grain, and that he and all his followers settle in both Venetius, in Noricum, and in Dalmatia. These demands, Jovius, who was Honorius's praetorian prefect, wrote down in Alaric's presence and dispatched to the emperor. Clearly, Alaric's initial intention was not the despoiling of the imperial city, but the securing of lands, food, and gold for his followers. Gothic respect for imperial prestige, despite the weakness of the Western Empire, was such that Alaric even sought an imperial title to legitimize his reign. Even at this late stage, Rome's fate was by no means sealed. However, Rome was, by the early 5th century, no longer the capital of the Western Empire. The transferring of the capital to Milan in the late 3rd century, and then to Ravenna in 401 AD, meant that Rome's political importance had waned somewhat, and Constantine's foundation of his new capital of Constantinople had accelerated this process. As a result, the Western Emperor Honorius, shut up in Ravenna, refused to negotiate with Alaric when the Gothic king threatened Rome. In late 408, an initial Gothic siege of Rome was ended when the city agreed to pay Alaric considerable tribute. Frustrated by Honorius's obstinate refusal to come to terms, Alaric once again marched on Rome in the summer of 410, facing almost no resistance. On the 24th of August 410 AD, the Salarian Gate was opened, whether by treachery or by starvation-induced desperation, and the Goths flooded into the Eternal City. The infamous sack of Rome was, by the standards of the day, remarkably restrained. Perhaps owing in large part to the fact that Alaric and his Goths were Christians, the vast majority of Rome's ancient monuments and Christian churches were left untouched. although the old Senate house was set on fire, as were 2 basilicas in the Forum, and all movable loot was plundered and carried off by the Goths. The citizens of Rome, however, would have suffered enormously, despite the lack of wholesale murder. Many inhabitants were tortured into revealing the location of hidden treasures, including the 85-year-old Saint Marcella, and thousands of Romans became refugees. For the first time in almost 800 years, the city had fallen to foreign invaders. Although Rome held little political or strategic importance anymore, the psychological impact of the sack was enormous. Here was the downfall of a symbolic city, from which the great ancient empire had issued forth. Contemporary writers, such as Jerome, lamented the fall. When the brightest light of the world was extinguished, when the very head of the Roman Empire was severed, the entire world perished in a single city. Others, such as St. Augustine of Hippo, sought to assuage the growing feeling that it was Rome's abandonment of the old pagan gods and the embrace of Christianity which had led to the downfall of the empire. Alaric's sack of the old capital precipitated a genuine spiritual crisis and spawned many attempts to understand or rationalize the fall, including Augustine's famous City of God. That said, the Western Emperor Honorius was apparently unconcerned. According to the Byzantine historian Procopius, he received the news of Rome's fall thus. At that time they say that the Emperor Honorius in Ravenna received the message from one of the eunuchs, evidently a keeper of the poultry, that Rome had perished. And he cried out and said, "And yet it is just eaten from my hands." For he had a very large cock, Rome by the name, and the eunuch, comprehending his words, said that it was the city of Rome which had perished at the hands of Alaric. And the emperor, with a sigh of relief, answered quickly, "But I thought that my foul Rome had perished." Despite their apparent triumph, Alaric and his Goths were in a precarious situation. The sack of the Eternal City effectively ended any chance of a settlement with Honorius, and with it the promise of permanent settlement which the itinerant Goths so craved. Deep in hostile territory, the Goths made southwards, apparently intending to cross to Sicily or into the rich provinces of Roman North Africa. However, stormy weather scuppered many of the ships that Alaric had gathered to facilitate the crossing, and in early 411 the great king himself died, perhaps of a fever. His followers supposedly buried him beneath the bed of the Busento River, and afterwards killed the gravediggers, in order to protect his resting place. Alaric's historical importance is hard to overstate. Not only did he sack the Eternal City, but it is arguably around him that the Goths who crossed the Roman frontier coalesced, going from a disparate group devastated by the impact of Hunnic raiding in the late 4th century to a united people who went on to found the Visigothic kingdom in southern Gaul in 418 AD. The next chapter of Gothic history centres around the Gothic kingdoms that emerged during the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in the west. The Visigothic kingdom in southern Gaul and latterly Spain, and the Ostrogothic kingdom in northern Italy. Both of these realms have a wealth of intriguing history and culture to consider, and deserve videos in their own right. Therefore, for now, we will leave the Goths in the south of Italy, mourning the loss of their great king, Alaric. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these videos, you can find additional content on my Patreon. You can also get early access to future videos and access to deleted scenes, in other words, sections that I cut from the main video.